Okay, some people coming in. We're not speaking to an empty hall, not even an empty net. Hello, everybody. Am I coming up, Jamie?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Foreign Press Association, where we have a timely briefing with Oriana Skylar Mastro, who I have to put up a government health warning, is up at 6 o'clock in the morning in Australia to speak to you. So let's give due deference and care to such heroic Stakhanovite devotion to duty. And Oriana is introducing her article, which is coming out, I think it's today, is it, or tomorrow, in Foreign Affairs, published in New York, about the threats from China to Taiwan and just how serious they are and what can be done about them. It seems to be a topical subject. I've noticed several other sort of webinars and seminars on similar subjects. And of course, looking at what's been happening in Hong Kong today with the arrest of the staff and editor of Apple News, it sort of vindicates some of the things we have been saying. We've consistently pushed for our colleagues and friends in Hong Kong. And in fact, we've also had our colleagues from Taiwan on our press briefings. We're also welcome. If anyone from Beijing wants to come on, we'll talk to them as well. We're not proud. So the situation is, of course, that a heavily armed People's Republic of China. Oh, other piece of news today, 28 jets flew right up to the boundary and sort of poked the Taiwanese defenses coming from the PRC. So there are people beating war drums. And I think that the big question that some of the people who read the article and in preparation for this were asking is, Oriana, just how serious is this? Is it just the Chinese, Beijing beating its chest and here we are, we're hairy and we're ready for battle? Are these serious?
Well, I think it depends on your perspective. As someone who looks at military planning and contingencies, things to prevent war have to be done years and years in advance. To me, this is a very urgent and serious problem, but not because something's going to happen this year, but because I think the situation might be potentially, I don't want to say irreversible, but inevitable if we don't do something within the next 4 years. So I think a lot of these demonstrations of force right now are not what's going to precipitate a war, the jets going to the center line, et cetera, but the structural changes that are in place and the change of mentality in Beijing is what makes it more and more likely that this war is going to occur.
And well, can you describe those structural changes? What is it that, for many years, China had a sort of fairly pragmatic attitude. You don't touch us, we don't touch you. And but they've been obviously increasingly nationalistic about building up the islands and taking coral atolls and turning them into artificial islands. They're pushing the territorial boundaries. I mean, is this a response to real strategic considerations, or is it posturing for their domestic? Because we often forget the Chinese have a public opinion as well. And in the absence of any serious socialist ideology in the Communist Party of China now, the way they seem to be competing is to out-nationalist each other. So, I mean, that's what's always worried me, is that as part of the internal battles in China, a bit like Washington in a way, people are going to beat their chests and show they're bigger and stronger and more nationalist than everyone else. And that can lead to untoward circumstances.
I think nationalism has a role to play, but it's a minor role compared to the other factors. I mean, China and the Chinese leadership has felt that Taiwan was a part of mainland China, and that the fact that these entities have been separated since the Civil War has been problematic for the party since 1949. So the nationalist fervor about Taiwan is largely relevant in that it gives the impression of great resolve to fight, in that the Chinese people might be willing to absorb a lot of costs, more costs than the American people in a conflict. But what's really changed is Chinese military capabilities, and then the personality of Xi Jinping, but most importantly, Chinese military capabilities. It's not surprising to me, whether it's Taiwan or South China Sea, that there used to be this period of relative stability and peace when China had zero capability to do anything militarily in these areas. In 2009 was the first time some of China's ships that could sail beyond visual range of their coast, start coming in line. So they start selling to the South China Sea. So this isn't sort of rocket science to me. And it's the same with Taiwan. In the mid-1990s, the last time we had a Taiwan Strait crisis, right, 95, 96, the United States sailed an aircraft carrier battle group in the vicinity of Taiwan, and this was enough to get, Beijing to calm down. But that's because their Taiwan invasion plan, used to be to commandeer some fishing vessels and try to paddle their way across the strait. I mean, the U.S. military had zero concern that in any possible circumstances they were going to be able to pull this off. But they realized that too. And so then they spent the next 25 years on an urgent military modernization program, one that was even, got a little boost in 2013 from Xi Jinping, who then started a complete reorganization of the military to deal with some of the softer issues of training and the ability of the services to work together. Large parts of that program ended in 2020, in that China now has certain platforms online, but they also believe they conduct joint operations, that for the first time, navies, Air Force, strategic rocket force can work together in a campaign, which is exactly what's necessary to do something like an amphibious landing on Taiwan. So this is why I think the options in Beijing has changed. And then you have Xi Jinping, who has clearly signaled his dissatisfaction with the status quo. Unlike other leaders, preventing Taiwan independence, I don't think is the goal anymore. I think it is promoting, reunification, in Beijing's words. So that's why the article is called Taiwan Temptation, because this is something I'm sure he would love to do. And now he has the ability to do it for the first time. And then I also discussed why I think, China might think the costs of a use of force are lower, maybe, than Western observers.
But this is, I understand, I don't know whether you've seen this, but the Chinese actually were extremely interested in the Falklands Isles operation from Britain in terms of long-term maritime combined forces seizing an island. And obviously, Taiwan's a bit closer to the mainland than the Falklands were to Britain, but the lessons about fighting across, a contested stretch of water on the home stretch were obviously taken on board as well. Have you seen any manifestation of that?
Well, I mean, they have studied. There's a great book by Taylor Fravel at MIT called Active Defense, in which he looks at Chinese military strategy over time. And he argues that, the nature of warfare itself is one of the main indicators of how China changes its own military strategy, even more so than the threats maybe that they personally face. And so it's been very common in the Chinese military to study other relevant operations. One of the large reasons that they embarked on a major military reform is when they saw the United States performance in the first Gulf War, and they realized the level of technology, sophistication, precision-guided munitions, the command control computers, communication, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, which we refer to as C4ISR, all of that coming together to allow the United States to bring massive amounts of firepower in a very precise way. That's what sort of sparked the desire in Beijing to get on board with that type of warfare. So they've always, really studied other militaries to try to figure out what they want to do, but also what they don't want to do. One interesting case of that is the Chinese, in their reorganization, they have something called the Strategic Support Force, where they've put space, cyber, and electronic warfare together. And I read a lot of Chinese writings for decades trying to figure out where to put space. And it used to be a part of the US Air Force, as some of our viewers might know. So the Chinese were discussing, should we make it a part of our Air Force? And now it's a separate command, like Cyber Command. And the Chinese have decided that those are, inefficient ways of doing it. So they also do things differently, but it's all based on a study of what countries like the United States, Great Britain, great powers have done in the past.
I've been reading the Chinese science fiction, the various volumes. They're actually quite illustrative about the way they think about these things, both in nationalist terms and the technology. But I mean, if they turned over the page, yes, you can get people there, you can land the troops. What happens then? I mean, did they look and see what happened to the US in Iraq? Or in Syria? Yes, you get there. Yes, you beat the enemy. And then 20 years later, you're still fighting the enemy. Now, these are the people who taught us about People's War. And they know that the people in Taiwan do not want them in the slightest. And it's a small island by their standards, but it's far bigger than Iraq. And if the PRC were to go there, they would have presumably a world of trouble afterwards. And have you seen plans for the occupation? Because we know that as far as winning hearts and minds go, we just have to look at Hong Kong and see it's a washout. They really do not know hearts and minds.
So this is something that Westerners bring up a lot. I think we take a lot of our experiences and we think, and this is across the board, we think, China's going to have the same issues we did or vice versa. But, in Chinese writings, they mention that the occupation, but they don't go into it in great detail because they are unconcerned. Because the landing is the hard part. So, China hasn't fought a war since 1979. Right. So their main and they've never done a joint operation like one of this scale. So in their mind, if they succeed in this, that's the hard part. Now, internal repression, that's something China has done for a very long time. They've honed their system. It is, I don't mean to condone it, but it's quite effective domestically, whether it's the control of information. There's a lot of self-censoring and self-regulation that's happening among the Chinese people. And so I understand the Chinese perspective on this. I mean, who in Taiwan is going to fight? I guess, they can't even get enough people to volunteer for their military, but let's just assume that all the people, at least who have some sort of military training, decide they're going to form some sort of insurgency afterwards. I mean, China has more people's armed police than they do young men in Taiwan. I think by some estimates, there are more Uyghurs in internment camps than there are young men in Taiwan. So I don't think that the military aspects of the aftermath is of primary concern. And I don't think that's where we can really shape their thinking. Now, the real thing is, what will the world look like afterwards? And China thinks, and again, I see where they're coming from on this, that, the world, it goes back basically to the way it was before, except they now have Taiwan. They've gotten a number of signals from the international community that it's not like people are going to be cutting off diplomatic relations, stopping all trade. I mean, there might be some economic sanctions for a few years, but nothing, definite. So if you really want to deter China, you have to convince them, not that there's going to be guerrilla warfare on the island of Taiwan, but that the world and the region, the way they see it today, can never go back to that after they use force. That's a more productive direction of thinking.
Amusingly on this one, I sometimes quote to Chinese colleagues, in Red Star Over China, Edgar Allan Snow interviews Chairman Mao and asks him about Formosa, Taiwan. And Chairman Mao says they will be able to determine their own future when the Japanese occupation finishes. They can make their own mind up about where they want to go. So, I mean, this particular thought of Chairman Mao seems to have been lost on the current generation, the idea that you need the consent. And surely that's going to play to some extent on world opinion, is that, okay, the status quo is a bit worrying and nobody has a dog in the fight in the sense of as long as it's just status quo. But an armed invasion against the wishes of the whole population surely has significant international repercussions, or don't you think so?
I mean, do you think so? I mean, I would hope so. But the other thing is that this has been on the minds of China for quite some time. Not only, the potential for an armed reunification, but in general, China's rise to great power status has been defined by their desire to be able to do whatever they think is best for themselves without other countries getting in the way. Right. And so if you look at their foreign policy strategy, for example, they've inked all these strategic partnerships with US allies and partners, countries all over the world. But all of them have a provision about Taiwan. And in particular, this idea that economic relationship between those countries is more important than what happens over Taiwan. Right. And so countries have kind of signed up to this. And I actually hear the Chinese talking points from government leaders of US allies and partners, which is Taiwan is a unique situation. How China reacts with respect to Taiwan is not indicative of what type of country they are overall. This is the message that Beijing has been trying to send out. And I think it has been relatively, it's been received. It also kind of depends on how the conflict happens, especially during the Trump administration. Even allies and partners might have sort of felt like the United States was provoking the issue, in which case maybe Beijing's response would have been seen as more legitimate. And so, of course, I think ideally that sort of use of force would engender a major international response across military, economic, and diplomatic spheres. But for a variety of reasons, how the international community has responded to other actions China has taken, with respect to Hong Kong or Xinjiang, and then in general, the prioritization of the economic relationships over the military and security components in many capitals of our allies and partners, especially in Europe, makes me think that maybe the Chinese are right that the costs wouldn't be as severe as the United States is hoping they are. And I think the Biden administration, one of the things about strengthening and building these alliances is they're trying to change the tide on those trends.
There's also other sort of geostrategic consequences. If the US has a long-standing security guarantee for Taiwan, if it washes its hands of that, then presumably Japan, Korea, Indonesia, and other countries in the area are going to scratch their heads and say, well, if we can't rely on the US and the so-called nuclear umbrella, then maybe it's time for us to go and get the necessary wherewithal. In fact, it's to some extent, I'm surprised that I'd be surprised if the Taiwanese didn't have a clandestine nuclear program. If I were them, I would.
What does the necessary wherewithal look like against China? I mean, so if I had to make predictions, I think it wouldn't go that direction. I don't think countries are like, okay, now I'm going to stand up to China on my own. I think what's more likely is some bandwagoning. Countries saying, okay, if I don't have the protection of the United States, I better be nicer to Beijing.
Send the tribute to Beijing.
Right. I mean, I think the situation is potentially even more dangerous than you lay out, because this mentality that is about US resolve, again, I think is somewhat outdated. In the 1990s, when China didn't have those military capabilities, US intervention was the determining factor of whether or not they would succeed in some sort of campaign. Now they assume US military intervention. And now the question is, are there certain types of campaigns in which they actually win, even though the United States intervenes? And so nowadays, there are some situations in which they would actually win. In my mind, this is worse for the US alliance system than if the United States doesn't come to Taiwan's aid. Because if the United States doesn't come to Taiwan's aid, there's uncertainty in other capitals, maybe about the US commitment, uncertainty about US capabilities. If the US comes to Taiwan's aid and loses, then you have certainty about the lack of capability. And so in my mind, other countries are in that scenario are even more likely to say, okay, this alliance thing is not working for me. I want to go another route. So it's very tricky, this balance between resolving capabilities. But that's why in my recommendations in the article, I mainly focus on not signals of US resolve, which I think are relatively ineffective and actually harmful to our ability to win. But I focus on the military capability side of building those capabilities to ensure that if necessary, the United States could prevail in this conflict.
Yeah, one of our correspondents, Fukiko Hamil, wants to know, how does D-Day affect Okinawa and Japan? So you've already started on that, but there is a very particular heavily armed American base there, which is tempting as well. If Taiwan, why not Okinawa?
Well, there's two situations. If China is sure, that the United States is going to intervene, they will hit U.S. bases in the region in their opening salvo, right? So these include, and especially include U.S. bases in Japan. If they're less sure, they may sort of wait and see. But then once the United States is conducting full-scale military operations from these bases, they will be immediate targets. Now, what does this mean for Japan? Largely depends on the Japanese government. I've talked to some colleagues in Japan, and I'm not a Japan expert. My knowledge extends to sort of China only, but I have heard from people that if China attacks U.S. bases only, that won't be enough to bring Japan fully into the fight. So this also, it could go either way, right? Countries could say, oh, it's a threat for me to host.
Is Okinawa a US base or is it Japanese territory? It's a bit difficult to disentangle them as the inhabitants there keep complaining.
Right. So I think it depends on Japanese domestic politics at the time. I mean, my hope would be that Japan would, be ready to fight full combat support with the United States in this contingency, also because some of the operational difficulties that the United States has that creates an opening for Chinese victory closes if Japan is involved. If the Japanese fight with the United States, then none of these issues that I'm talking about would exist. China has no scenario under which they could prevail. Therefore, they're not going to initiate that conflict. We go back to the previous, more strong, status quo. But it's my impression that the Japanese, domestic polity is not on that trajectory in which they're willing to completely abandon their constitutional restraints in support of engaging in full combat operations in the region with the United States. So that seems to be just, in my mind, a hypothetical, but I think that's really about Japanese politics more than anything else.
I mean, ironically, the indigenous Taiwanese are quite fond of Japan. They didn't resent the occupation the way other Chinese sort of occupation zones did. And I understand part of that was because it was the Japanese Navy that ran the place rather than the army, and they were A kind and B treated Taiwan as a massive aircraft carrier facing into the China Sea, which has implications for this as well because of its control of the South China Sea.
I think it's also interesting, you mentioned this before, about sort of the nationalism or the perception. In China, it is important to believe that the people of Taiwan still want to be a part of China. A lot of this discussion that I see about, peaceful reunification is never happening. These are happening kind of at the political elite levels. If you look also in Chinese media, I find it so fascinating that when the Taiwan arms sales go through, that there's less critique. There's not a critique of the people of Taiwan, right? They say, oh, poor little Taiwan that's forced by the United States to buy these arms. Or there's critiques of Tsai Ing-wen, who, it just fascinates, who has apparently these very powerful manipulative forces in which she can, control the minds of her whole population. But it's very important in the minds of the Chinese people to believe that, as Xi Jinping says, it's just a handful of problematic, entities, a handful of separatists. Broadly speaking, the people of Taiwan would love to be a part of the whole Chinese nation rejuvenation.
The old phrase at it. But that sort of introduces an interesting question on the home front. I mean, I think from what you're saying, you're sort of you're reinforcing that if Beijing were to mount an invasion, unless there were massive visible casualties, then there would be very little domestic opposition to it. It's a very popular thing. Most mainland Chinese, even if they're not very happy with the government, think, yes, it's ours, we should go fetch.
So I have heard, some of my colleagues in China, I've had some conversations with people about this article. And one of the things they say is that, the average Chinese person really just cares about economic development, government efficiency. They don't want to get derailed from that. But then in the next breath, when we talk about a possible war with Taiwan, they'll say costs do not matter. We will pay any cost to get Taiwan. So in my mind, I think there's these sort of dual emotional things of like, yes, of course, average times, everyone really just wants to improve their own lives. But there might be some sort of switch that happens if the war actually happens, and then the Chinese people are like, I'm willing to do this. So there is a question about that, because some say that a very costly war could be risky for Xi Jinping, but they're primarily designing quick fait accompli type of wars. If it looks like the war is going to be of a protracted kind of major nature and they can't get around that, then again, I don't think they initiate this conflict, because the United States still has some advantages, logistical, operational advantages in a protracted war, though the Chinese write that they have disadvantages on the resolve side. So a lot of these conflicts, the way the Chinese think about it is, they might go to take Taiwan thinking this could be a quick operation. The United States can't even bring firepower to bear in time before we get it. And if it looks like that it's not going that way, maybe they just take a couple offshore islands, stop there, claim victory, and wait another day. But if they do find themselves in a long, high intensity, protracted conflict, then they have, strategically failed. That's not what they're planning for, and they understand the limitations that they face in that type of conflict.
Well, has Jonathan Kapstein wants to know, has Taiwan responded by heightening military and international political activities? It's not clear to me what is going on in Taipei, he says. I mean, obviously some people there are worried, but how worried are they? They don't seem to. Given the due, they don't seem to be preparing the population. You don't hear the war drums in the streets of Taipei, and they're not, they're not going around whipping up anti-PRC fervor, although there's obviously caution and upset about it, and they're making very plain they don't want to be part of it. But I mean, they're not really. Are they preparing their people and their military for any type of struggle?
So you can't say they're not preparing, right? Like, I think, Taiwan, does have a military, and they do, for example, have very sophisticated hardening of their facilities in case of, a PRC onslaught. But it does sort of refer to this general feeling, which I think is correct, that domestic politics has trumped military necessity within Taiwan, whether it comes to the types of capabilities or platforms that they want to buy. Sometimes it seems like they are more interested in kind of prestige weapons and those that would actually help defend them. What needs to happen is, no one expects Taiwan to be able to defend itself, but it needs to be able to hold out long enough for the United States to get there, right? So so mines are more important than them having some fancy submarines or something like that. So the type of capabilities matter. And the second component, it has to do with US resolve. If the American people and those in uniform are going to potentially make the ultimate sacrifice for their freedom, that's a lot harder to stomach if the people of Taiwan won't even sign up to serve, right? I was talking to a senator's a staffer about this just yesterday, who was asking me, how do we get the American people on board? And I always say, I don't know. I'm not an Americanist, but one thing I can say is, if the people of Taiwan are not willing to fight for themselves, it's really hard to ask Americans to fight for them. And, they've tried to switch this all volunteer force, and they haven't been able to get enough volunteers. They don't have broader conscription. This isn't like an Israel type of situation in which everyone has to serve for a period of time. A change like that would I think change Beijing's calculus, and also change U.S. calculus in terms of the cost it's willing to bear to protect the island. So I would be hopeful that it would go in that directions. But in the multiple trips that I've taken to Taiwan to talk about some of these issues, it doesn't really seem like that there are politicians who take the threat seriously enough to shift it in that direction.
So this means they're being sort of complacent in the face of an overwhelming threat, or they realize that if they introduce conscription tomorrow, this would be seen as provocation by Beijing, surely.
Well, I don't think we have to worry. I don't think it's about the provocation. Beijing is not going to that's not enough of a provocation for China to say, oh, we're going to lose Taiwan forever because of, conscription. So we have to make the move now. My sense it is much more domestic politics. Like, the person who introduces that is not going to get reelected. That type of thing. I think it's really, really that basic. And in general, this is how these things work, right? National security trumps everything when it's really at the forefront. People always ask me about, but what about the economics? In the history of conflicts, when a conflict has happened, countries are willing to make huge economic sacrifices for the sake of their national security. The question is, what is that threshold for the people of Taiwan? And for whatever reason, the threshold seems to be much higher than maybe it would be elsewhere. And part of it is because they've been living with this, this status quo that has relatively worked for so long. But, China today is not the China of 25 years ago. If you had asked me even 5 years ago if China would ever attack Taiwan, I would have said, I can't envision any scenario in which that would happen. So, things change. And so policies have to change.
Well, Ted Falk is making, I think, the far-fetched presumption, since the PRC has everything to lose by invading Taiwan, nothing to gain, why would they do something so stupid? Well, I think you've answered the question to some extent. Nationalism is inherently stupid. Just ask all the Brexit voters in Britain.
Yeah, everything to lose, nothing to gain. I would say everything to gain. Taiwan countries think about territory, and not only strategically, but the social construct of what territory is theirs in very strong terms. I think they would see unification with Taiwan as a huge benefit. There's also the benefit, either if the United States doesn't come to Taiwan's aid or they beat the United States, that basically means the end of the US alliance system and role in the region. They get to be the regional hegemon, which means they get to determine the order, in perpetuity. That seems to be like a pretty
Middle
big,
Kingdom is back with nubs on.
benefit. Xi Jinping gets to, be the guy who brought Taiwan back into the mix and got to realize national rejuvenation, which is what they've been waiting for ever since the colonial powers came in to exploit them hundreds of years ago. So to me, that seems to be a lot of benefits. What is the downside? If from their perspective, some economic sanctions, potentially some casualties of military personnel, loss of platforms, which, they can rebuild, so that's where I kind of see that a lot of Westerners really focus, because they don't understand maybe the relationship between the mainland and Taiwan. They're like, why can't China just be happy not getting what it wants and being number two and having to adhere to US dictation for the rest of their lives? That seems pretty nice. But, so I just don't think, maybe we see it that way. But in my readings of what the Chinese are writing and saying about this issue, I don't think they see the costs and benefits in the same way.
Well, Beijing blew it with its one nation, two systems in terms of persuading the Taiwanese peacefully. What they've done in Hong Kong is basically ensured that there'll probably be a homeopathic minority in Taiwan that would go for any such system, and knowing the consequences. What would be the indications that the Chinese are moving seriously on this? Apart from massive movements of columns from the north to the south to the beachhead.
Well, this is the main problem, right? Because there's sort of two things. One, the United States needs a lot of warning in order to respond adequately. And so we're constantly asking ourselves, like, what would that warning look like? Now, you've talked about mass mobilizations, but one of the things of, like, as you mentioned, that we just had another bomber fleet head to the center line, they're trying to routinize mass mobilizations, such that when that happened today, did anyone think, oh, the Chinese are invading today? No, they thought, oh, this is just another time that they're doing this, right? So it also, I think, reduces, it desensitizes us to these sort of large scale mobilizations. I've heard from some Chinese colleagues that what would change is we'd see more mentions of Taiwan in work reports at the party Congress, if they're really trying to get what would really change is we'd see much more social mobilization efforts. As you mentioned, we'd see much more discussion and campaigning from the party to the people about, it's time to get ready to eat bitterness. We're going to fight this war. And there are some studies that suggest that that kind of discourse does change right before conflict. But from the military perspective, that's what they've been doing for 25 years, is getting ready, right? So my main argument is they've done that, and now they're ready. Now, a lot of US military experts like myself try to evaluate if they're really ready. And there's a debate, the Chinese prepare for 4 campaigns. They have the joint missile campaign, the blockade, counter-intervention, which is just attacking basically US bases and stuff in the region. And then the amphibious landing. Everyone agrees they can do the first 3. The debate is really about the landing. Some Chinese scholars, I think they still need a couple of years to refine and hone their command and control, and do some practice before they can be really confident. Some other scholars say they need even more time than that. But what's important is when I talk to the Chinese military, they say they're ready now. Right? So they think they can do it. Now, maybe they can't, but they think they can do it. And I think that's, what's the most problematic when we're trying to deter conflict.
Since they were studying the Falklands, they should have noticed it was in the Duke of Wellington's words, a nearly dam run thing. All it would have taken would be a lucky torpedo or 2, and the whole British invasion over 10,000 miles would have fallen splash. It was very close as it was. It was far from a sure thing. And, across an extended reach of water like this, are there any, what militarily can the Taiwanese do? I'm not necessarily secret weapons, but what can they do to make sure that landings will be so costly that they're held offshore and, suffer massive casualties? You've mentioned mines. You discounted submarines. I'd have thought submarines and torpedoes would have been an integral part of stopping any maritime landing, one way or another, static or mobile underwater defenses.
So there's sort of 2 components. The first, the difference between today and D-Day, is that China is going to have control over the air and sea, right? So it's not that these aren't going to be contested environments in the same way, right? So because that's how, first of all, they have the air defense systems, which basically make it very difficult for other countries to operate in these waters, because China can very easily shoot them down. And then they have their own aircraft to conduct strikes against Taiwan. Now you have, only the Taiwan, Air Force that can basically try to counter, but they don't have the numbers to really take on this onslaught. It's the same thing with their defenses. Of course, they have missile defenses, but those can be easily saturated by the number of missiles that are going to be bearing down on them. And so the problem here is that the main line of defense is going to happen basically at the shore. It's going to be very hard to get them, in the airspace and at the sea, in the shortest period, the shortest distance between Taiwan and China is 80 miles, right? So it's a pretty quick type of thing. And then you have, they're going to airdrop people in, and they're going to do the amphibious landing. So the mines are helpful because they're already there, right? If you put mines in, you don't need advanced, kind of as much advanced warning. The problem with submarines, especially from the US perspective, is they have to be flushed out and they have to be in a good position, kind of, before, and you need enough of them before the action happens. And so some of this is just kind of timeline stuff. But there's only a few landing sites. And so the people, so Taiwan has been very focused on trying to put forces, artillery, everything necessary at those few landing sites. And this is also where a lot of the debate is. If you ask people who say that, Taiwan can repel an invasion, when you dig deeper into their argument, it's not that Taiwan can repel an invasion. It's that they can make it costly for China to land. And I guess, my argument is that if they get Taiwan, they're not so concerned about the cost. I really do believe that even if, the United States manages to sink their whole Navy in the meantime, they can build another Navy. If they get Taiwan, they're willing to take those types of risks. And so I think a lot of the disagreement about how dangerous this is depends on different perceptions of risk to China of doing this.
And I mean, the US has showed both on its own right and in its proxy Israel in terms of missile defenses that clever missiles can do a lot of damage. I mean, the Argentinians discovered that with their Exocets, which almost finished the British effort in the Falklands. Technology's moved on a lot. Do the Taiwanese have that type of technology where, you know, they can hit the ships as they're leaving port on the other side once they're convinced they're coming?
China is the only country in the world that can hit like moving ships at sea. I mean, China has the most advanced cruise and ballistic program in the world. So
did anyone tell the President Trump?
I think, you know, well, yeah, I mean, that's why our aircraft carriers are not going to get anywhere near the place. I mean, that's the huge difference, right? Like 1995, we sail, you know, there and we're like, fine. I don't think there's any commander now that if we're going to fight a war with China, brings the carriers anywhere within the strike distance of their DF-21Ds. You know, it's just too much of a risk. So these are just ways that the operational environment has changed significantly in the past couple of decades. I think, of course, you know, it's the sophistication, precision, and then also the number of missiles that matters. I'm not saying, of course, Taiwan is going to get some shots in, but China can then, you know, wherever those, you know, and maybe they're mobile, and, you know, we don't know how good China is at finding, you know, mobile systems, but for a large part, there's, you know, Taiwan is, they have the assets, the intel assets to be looking for these things. They have a lot of human on the ground in Taiwan. So it's not going to be enough. And so the big issue wasn't so defenses. I mean, that used to be a big deterrent because they didn't matter because they didn't really have the option. Even if it was relatively uncontested, it would have been hard for them to take Taiwan before these military reforms. Because for example, they didn't control the airspace. Like in a previous type of scenario, those air defenses weren't there. Their ships didn't even have air defenses on them. Chinese ships had no ship-based air defense. You had the US carriers that could sail wherever they wanted. So the United States was going to be flying around in the air and just picking off the Chinese as they're trying to go across the strait. I mean, that used to be the scenario. And now it's basically going to be the Chinese controlling the air. And so it'll be very hard for, you know, their ships to be targeted, you know, at least from the surface as they're going across.
Yes, I've always thought that aircraft carriers are sitting ducks waiting to be hit. But if you have missile technology. Somebody, Jonathan Kapstein again, wants to know if you have any reading on what the Russian government thinks of all of this, and does it have a role in it? Because, you know, they have their own reunification program, of course. So, you know, with Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, the rest.
Yeah, I just finished this major project on China-Russia relations. And what's interesting, so I would argue that China and Russia are very deeply aligned militarily, but the scope of their alignment is limited. And that scope is just Russia supporting China contest US hegemony in Asia. So it doesn't go the other way around. It's not like China is going to be helping Russia and Europe. It doesn't extend to third parties. They're not coordinating in any sort of significant military way towards, you know, in other regions of the world. Russia sees it in its interest. I'm not a Russian specialist, but based on, you know, some Russian writings that I've seen and Russian behavior, it looks like Russia sees it in their interest to help China basically undermine US power in Asia. To that end, they've been much more supportive, whether it's discourse, behavior. They've done these joint operations, these joint air patrols in the region together, of China's sort of military assertiveness in the region. One of the things that's interesting about, you know, the Russian component is I don't think Russia would be fighting with China. That's not really how great powers do things. They don't sort of fight side by side. They don't put their forces under the command of other countries' forces. It's not the same type of relationship as the United States with an ally partner like Japan or Australia. But Russia could be, in many cases, a sanctuary for China, in that if you imagine right now, their defense industries are very mutually supporting. They're doing more joint development of systems. And so let's just say we do have a major war and the United States is trying to, really destroy the Chinese war machine. If they continue to get weapons from Russia, that becomes harder. We can't really blockade China from land. So they're going to get oil and stuff, from Russia. It makes it really harder in a protracted conflict to put the squeeze on China if they have that Russian support. You could also see China and Russia doing defensive operations in a conflict. So let's just say we have the situation with Taiwan. China and Russia say, okay, we need to do, some air patrols to maintain stability in the East China Sea. Right. Russia's not fighting the war, but they're just there to ensure that no war happens there. But that also denies the United States that airspace for operation. And then the US has to ask itself in all these scenarios, do we target Russia because, it's making it harder for us to defeat China? And I think the escalatory dynamics of that are very problematic. And so the Russian involvement in something like Taiwan, I think, would be much more intelligence support, logistical support, resources support, but that could be potentially significant in the end.
It's almost reminiscent of 1939, 1940, when the Soviets persuaded the Japanese to back off, protects their rear while they carry on the other end of the mass, of the continental mass. But coming back to Taiwan on the political thing, have they been hobbled? Because they've given up the fight in some ways over the issue of support. They got sort of a small number of countries recognize them. A lot more, I think, sort of are friendly disposed to them on both economic and sort of socio-political grounds. I think most people recognize that Taiwan is a social democracy, almost a European social democracy in the China Sea, and is worthy of support on moral grounds. But as you sort of pointed out, moral grounds go to the winds when nationalism and warfare starts. So can they do anything else to rally support?
Yeah, this is a tough question, because I think the main line so far has been, Taiwan as a democracy, and we should, protect Taiwan as a democracy against, autocratic absorption. And that was the main line of argument in the Trump era. And I don't know how effective. I mean, maybe it should have been effective from the moral grounds, but there is also these sort of strategic components of people being like, well, that's great, but, everyone would love to be a democracy, but, these are the strategic scenarios. I think increasing Taiwan's international space and what Taiwan has been trying to do of, strengthening its relationships with other countries help. The more connectivity that they have with other countries, the more person-to-person interactions there are, the more I think people are willing to consider and think about these topics. And so Taiwan has always been sophisticated in those types of efforts. I mean, but they've been very focused, like on the United States, for example. The Taiwan, there are people who are very focused politically, policy-wise on Taiwan. And so I think there's somewhat of a very effective and sophisticated like Taiwan lobby, not to maybe the same degree or through the same mechanisms, but kind of like how you would see an Israel lobby in the US. It would behoove Taiwan to try to establish those type of deep connections with key individuals in other countries. I think that would probably be helpful as a way forward. Many more exchanges, maybe have similar types of scholarship programs to bring students to Taiwan for a period of time, to really let them see, what the issues are. But again, it's, I went on one of these birthright trips to Israel when I was in college. It's like a free trip to Israel. So it's like, you might as well go. And I remember, part of the whole thing was them like amplifying the threat, right? Like that was the thing, is they take you around and be like, you could die at any moment. You'd always have these armed people your age who are armed that were escorting you everywhere. So their sense was like, we need this defense, we need this support from the United States. The problem is, like, when you go into Taiwan society, you have this sense that like there's nothing wrong, that there is no threat. So there would have to be some of those societal changes. But I think it is a very important question, one of which, we currently have to consider of, what can Taiwan do to help itself? And I think, being a important strategic partner, but also trying to establish that emotional connection with other countries is probably the way to go.
What about in the international era, the organizations? You have, you've got the International Civil Aviation Authority, World Health Organization, a lot of very strategic organizations where it is plain common sense that it's a catastrophic hole in the global governance that that Taiwan isn't represented in the International Civil Aviation or the Maritime Organization, whatever. So what, push and pull, is the Biden government, is the Biden administration going to push back there and start doing things that the Chinese would regard as provocative in terms of recognizing Taiwan? And are the Taiwanese going to start pushing more and, saying, hey, we're going along, but don't expect us to tell you when the next plague is coming if you don't let us in on the council?
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think Taiwan's response has been, not to be too difficult about this, but maybe they should kind of signal what the costs would be. Another way to think about, some of these organizations, one other way to help Taiwan build international power would be, there are a lot of areas and gaps in the international order. The United States basically stopped this institution building decades ago. They're like, oh, after World War II, we've thought of everything. Like, we don't have to do this anymore. But obviously a lot has changed since then. And so there are many areas where we need new institutions, whether it be, outer space treaties,
climate change.
I would say climate change, proliferation of surveillance technologies, I think should be regulated, just like weapon systems are regulated, and only being sold to certain types of governments under certain type of conditions. All these things. So the United States could, and I think should start a new campaign of institution building. And in that context, from the ground up, the question isn't, Taiwan threatening what could happen if they're not a part. The question is, we basically create these institutions that have institutional power that are important. And we say to China, you can be a part of it or not, but Taiwan's going to be here. Now, if China decides not to be a part of it, then we have, we have more tools in which the United States is a leader and China's on the sidelines. I think that is more important than, what China could possibly bring to bear. Of course, we'd love them to sign a treaty saying they're not going to blow stuff up in space, but even if they sign the treaty, they're going to do it anyway. So at the very least, you can have Taiwan in the international organization and then also have China look bad. So I think it's hard with institutions that are already kind of in place to start there, maybe try to build Taiwan's international space through new institutions. And of course, Beijing's not going to like that. But one of the silver linings of my argument is they really, they will initiate when it is the best situation for them to do so. And I do think they still want to wait a couple of years. So I don't think they're going to allow some of these like lower level provocations to force them into a war at an unfavorable time for them. So I think we have much more space at the lower levels to be exploring options than potentially people think we do.
Well, the big gaping self-inflicted wound for the US, of course, is the very relevant to the center line and the South China Sea, is the International Convention on the Law of the Sea, which the US was heavily involved in negotiating and has still failed to ratify. And the Pentagon, the State Department, almost every responsible, sane adult in the US government thinks it should be ratified, but we still haven't. We still haven't got round to it. So, is that something that it seems to be almost a sine qua non if the US is going to fight about this, because other countries there are invoking the International Convention against China. In fact, China, I think, has signed it and mentions it, but it's very difficult to plead for it to be invoked and at the same time not sign it. It's not impossible for the US because it does things like that often, but
so I think what happened, so the United States hasn't ratified it, but they abide by it. As you refer to, China has ratified it, but does not abide by it. They actually added an amendment to it in which they said, our domestic law supersedes this law, and our domestic law says we can do whatever we want.
Which nullifies the signature. And under the International Convention is very carefully constructed, so you accept all of it or none of it. You can't claim benefits from it and not accept the full.
Well, so they accept it. They just said, we redefine all these terms to different purposes. But for a very long time, that worked. That was enough. The fact that the United States actually abides by it and supports it, while China, didn't. So it has become much more of this sort of soft power discourse type of situation. And the past couple of times I've testified on the Hill, they've always asked about UNCLOS and whether or not the United States should ratify it. I mean, in general, the United States doesn't like to agree to international agreements that constrain its, use of military power. Even if we're not going to do stuff, we don't like other countries to tell us what to do. I mean, this is a whole separate issue that I think is fascinating when it comes to the China challenge that a lot of people maybe don't realize, which is different countries, I think, have different levels of acceptance of how much sovereignty they're willing to sacrifice for the sake of avoiding a war. So I'm calling you from Australia right now, and I will tell you that, as an American, I think the American people, the American government, the amount that we will allow foreign dictation in our policy is zero. Like foreign governments want to come in and tell us what to do, what to say, it's go time. In a lot of other countries that have lived in a world in which they have not been the dominant hegemon, they have lived with a degree of foreign dictation for a very long time. Now, Americans, we like to believe that foreign dictation is benevolent to a certain degree, but there is a loss of sovereignty that happens in smaller nations. The question is, what is that degree and what does it mean for their future? And so the United States strategy, I think, of going around to countries and saying don't accept Huawei because then China will have some influence on you. They're kind of well, these countries are going to have some influence on us. The question is, what are the costs and benefits of that? And so, I've been arguing for a while that I think the U.S. alliance construct should focus much more on, not that we're going to, of course, we'll defend our allies against military attack, but that's no longer good enough, really, because China is not, besides Taiwan, China is not really going to be fully occupying any of our allies anytime soon. So I think we should really focus on this resiliency issue and trying to create a situation in which being a partner of the United States means that your sovereignty is protected, while being a partner of China means, a huge degree of loss of your sovereignty. So Americans we focus on the signaling. We're like, oh, maybe the narrative isn't right. Sometimes the narrative isn't right, but sometimes the policy isn't right. That has to be true first, right? That it's better to be a partner of the United States than China. First, that has to be true. And then we have to get to the sort of that signaling part.
When dealing with Beijing and Moscow, there's this question, Rabbi Burns, if I can get through the Scots, so would the good, the gifty gears to see ourselves as others see us? I mean, they're looking and thinking, basically America is looking at Beijing and saying, who do you think you are, Washington? You can't do things like that. We can. And I don't think people in America realize that's the effect that the impression they're giving, as you pointed out. And it's, I don't know whether the symbolism can be stepped back in the face of the military, but it's another issue. Final question, is Taiwan going to get a nuclear weapon?
No.
Okay.
Not only are they not going to get nuclear weapons, but it's not going to really matter. I mean, they don't have any strategic depth in terms of escalation. China has a lot of nuclear weapons and is a target sponge. Do you want to play nuclear chicken with China? I think the answer to that is no. So
it's not the option, is it?
And in the process of getting that nuclear weapon, we basically guarantee war. Whether the United States is trying to give them one or whether they build one, that is a scenario that China will say, okay, it's better for us to fight this war, now. So,
okay, on this gloomy note,
on that gloomy note,
mushroom clouds in the South China Sea. We'll finish. I have to thank you very much indeed for a comprehensive, wide-ranging, and intensive discussion. And it does need more discussion, because I think half the problem with this is the stuff is not being looked at, isn't being discussed. So this is Ian Williams from the Foreign Press Association. I'm thanking for Oriana Skylar Mastro for getting up at the crack of dawn in Australia. I see dawn is peeking through the window to your left, to your right. So enjoy the rest of the day, and we'll see you all soon. We have lots more briefings coming up, equally provocative, I hope, and we'll see you soon. Ready to roll, Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you.